Welcome back to the Wallace branch, and today we're going to start working on a lumber industry east of Wallace, and then we'll be tackling the first part of the town, namely the residential area. However, first I'm just sketching in some of the scenery between Wallace and Mullan, Idaho. I'm first drawing in the stream up to Mullan, and then I'm going to come back with the highway splines. For the stream, you can see that the present-day terrain gives a pretty good idea of where that stream should go, and presumably the highway followed the present interstate more or less, although I don't really have a good idea of that. Like I mentioned already, I have a feeling the tracks weren't really like this at all, but I opted to keep things simple by having them as double track. As for the highway, I just eyeballed it. Partly it's that I don't feel I have a more accurate track profile for this area anyway, but also it's partly that I don't think the area is going to get a lot of viewing. We'll probably be sending AI trains through this area, even though the two towns are pretty close. As I put down the highway, it started to look like everything was going to fit, albeit with some tight curves on the highway as you come into town here. The last section, that's where the highway has to make a turn into the town, and then the lumber industry is going to fit in that little spot by the tracks. And the river is going to have to move a little bit to make way for that, but that's no problem. I didn't bother with texture or foliage in this part, in this video. I did that off camera, and also off camera, just there's a section here where I did the stream banks because those are especially tedious to watch. For the lumber mill, I do have the Sanborn map of this area. It also appears in the distance on this rather unique photo from the Barnard Stockbridge collection. However, I decided to use some assets that I created for the morning mine, which, at this point I hadn't started putting them down yet, but I had these assets already created. I felt that the wooden buildings kind of matched well what was probably in the general area. And admittedly, they're a bit new looking, and also I don't know what the color of the original buildings were. The red siding, though, is fairly generic, and I'm going to use it in a lot of other places around the map. It could use a little weathering, though. As I said, have the track layout, but nothing about operations, so I decided to make this just like a platform, and then some different buildings and places to store lumber here and there. This dirt road spline used to be great when I was working on Kickstarter County, but now I find that it has an odd shadow against the PBR textures, so I don't think I can use it. Approach Medium in his tutorial recommends making tire tracks with really small brushes, but I think that's probably too much work for right now. I'm a little bit eager to get on. I made a kind of a half-hearted effort here that you can see, but then I kind of bailed out, opted not to do it that way. And partly the issue with this idea is the texture limit again. Like, I'm limited to the number of textures I can use. So yeah, not going to do that. Not right now anyway. The boardwalk spline, it gets used a lot. I changed the colors of several of these Old West assets, including this one. It's really useful, and I think it might have been created by Frank Dean, really prolific creator. The wall here, that does seem to have a little bit too much ivy, but actually it turned out to look okay, especially after you get a little bit of shrubbery to blend it in. In a few places elsewhere on the map, I wanted to use this wall asset again, and then I also wanted to kind of reskin it so that it didn't have that ivy, but it's one of those assets where the image file isn't included, and I looked around for some other images to use, but I never really figured out a good one to use. And I also never figured out if the PEV soft can extract that texture. Anyway, I decided not to bother making my own retaining wall for now, other than the concrete one, of course. The DLS has a huge variety of lumber assets. Later, I actually created my own custom lumber load for flat cars, and also to use as a static scenery asset. And the reason I did that was I think these default flat cars, the ones that I was using on Kickstarter County, for example, they have these perfect stacks of plywood that don't really look realistic to me. Great, it's based on a cube, right? But I wanted it to look a little bit more weathered, but also a little bit more random stacking going on. I'm not sure if I'm going to replace the stacks that I'm putting down here, though. Fans of Kickstarter County will recognize this lumber mill shed asset. The colors match, and actually, it's the right size. It kind of even looks like it belongs here more than it did in that other layout. Again, one thing that I like to emphasize is that having larger buildings on their own layer, it's one of the most useful things. And I do have a large building layer, I have a spline layer, a road dane layer, and then when things kind of get completely out of hand, I usually end up putting some large hitbox assets on just random other layers. For example, when you have multi-industry new tracks, you have to have, if they're too close together, you have to have them all on their own layer. So I just end up using whatever's handy, like the highway layer or the spline layer. And of course, I had to go around adding vehicles, tanks that serve unknown purposes, barrels, a little garbage area in the back, more trucks, bushes, grass, just kind of going around and around, trying to think of what would help fill up the empty spaces without maybe going overboard with too many things added in. As I mentioned, also, I don't plan to make it a full-on lumber mill. Rather, I'm thinking of this as kind of like a staging point where lumber is actually delivered or picked up for use in the mines. One of the differences that I plan versus the Drexel to Avery route is kind of more interesting operations, even though we're dealing with a scenic area with a lot of distances. It's kind of funny that this rather insignificant industry turns out to be the second one on the layout after the Hercules concentrator. The more important ones are going to be the smelter, the mines, and some related industries in the towns along the way. Almost every town is going to have some industrial function for the railroad to serve, even if it's fictional, and Wallace is going to have several industries to serve. Here are some gigantic lumber stacks that fill in some space nicely, and they probably match the load for some kind of bulkhead flat. I don't know what, but perhaps they don't really match the area and the time period that we're modeling. I don't know. Anyway, I'm gonna keep them for now. Maybe I should mention here at the beginning that starting at the end of the last episode, the resolution of my recording drops significantly. I have no idea what happened. I did change some of the settings on OBS because initially it wasn't really getting the full screen, which you'll notice in most of the videos. And maybe I fixed that, but then the result was the resolution fell by a lot. And actually, the recording has a big blank area with the screen capture just in like the upper left-hand corner. So this is actually zoomed in on that upper corner. I don't know how long that persisted, how long it took until I actually noticed that this was happening. But it was several days. So I did ultimately figure that out, but I really hope you don't mind. I'm not going to redo the entire layout just to make a better recording, if you can see what I mean. So this episode alone is, it's covering several days of route building. Next up is I worked on these bridges over the river, and that required cutting the embankment spline and making a new one that had a lower wall so that the street could pass through. I made a bunch of these just flat planes of different widths for bridges in this area, and I wanted them to be able to match the pavement color of the Toomey Airport texture. So I just directly used the Toomey Airport texture on these spline assets. But for some reason, the color got slightly off, and I did come back and correct that a little bit later. I don't know what happened there, but it's not going to be visible for now. Um, and then I put spline markings on top and road stains on top of the Toomey Bridge texture spline. And then I also created this concrete railing for those bridges. And the reason why I created the railing as like a separate spline is that all the bridges are at an angle, so it wouldn't really work for the bridge to just have one square spline. I think it's better to have to place these road surfaces and then the road edges as separate splines, even though that's tedious. The road stain spline that I put on top of most of the streets throughout the layout, it's a little bit frustrating because its intensity, its darkness, depends on the angle, both the viewing angle and also the angle that you place it at. It's something to do with the nature of the normal map, I guess, but I don't understand. Um, you see that I tried it in one direction and then the other. It's all very mysterious to me. I do still use the very thick road splines. I don't do all hand laid roads. Maybe I should do hand laid roads everywhere, but I don't. Think that they're very thick. These highway assets, they're extremely thick splines because the creators want to make sure that the PBR textures don't clip through them, which is something that people do take screenshots of and ask what's going on. I've modified the base textures that I'm using around all the roads so that they have that zero height. So there's never going to be any clipping for any asset. And that's why I'm able to lower the road here to get it nice and flush. I'm not going to do that everywhere. It's just where this is extremely visible connection to the other hand laid road. For road markings, the installed road splines are a good guide for how wide to make the US lane markings. But then once you have a set of those down, which I'm doing here, then you save it as a scrapbook asset and paste it and reorient it at will. These in Wallace, these are all simple roads. I don't have any lanes. I don't have turn lanes at any intersections. Now, it's true that the actual real Wallace is a small town, and many of the roads, many of the intersections, they don't have any lines at all. Uh, just stop sign and that's it. Lanes would make it more realistic when you're looking at it, though. But still, I thought it was better to make some fast progress given the amount of work that's left to be done. I added road stain splines and also spots of oil drippings around some intersections. They have to be on their own layer because the hitbox for these little drippings is extremely large. So I have this special stains layer just for that reason. Wallace famously eliminated the last stoplight on I 90 from Boston to Seattle when the interstate finally opened through town. And the town actually held a mock funeral for the poor thing in 1991. I'm not sure where that stoplight was, but I decided to add a few blinking yellows and reds just to add interest, like at this center of the universe intersection here. And, after all, 1991, that's after the time period that we're modeling anyway, so I think it's appropriate. This here is the spot on 6th Street where the park and the depot are today after the depot was relocated due to the interstate construction. It's now a museum. Up to the 1960s, this spot was filled with some small wooden buildings, very Old West style buildings, and then they were all torn down at some point and they were replaced by some sort of cinder block grocery store. And then this spot was the set for the Casper, Wyoming scene of Heaven's Gate in 1979, where they erected some huge false fronts to hide that ugly grocery store. And then that was torn down, I don't think very long after that grocery store got torn down. And, when they moved the depot, they moved it into this location to create the city park. Now, if you're still with me, perhaps by now you're getting a little bit of a sense for how detailed some parts of this layout are going to be. Off camera, there are two bridges by the UP depot, and then one down by the NP depot, and then one down by the yard. As I was saying earlier, you can see how these bridges have some very sharp angles, so that's why I think I had to have the concrete railings or edge splines as separate assets. It would be nice if there was a procedural solution there, but that's the way it is. The UP depot has very limited space around it for parking. I did add parking on both sides of the depot, and I also left a room for a place for trucks to come in and out with larger items in the rear of the depot where there's that ramp that you can see for the freight shed. On the other side, I made a small passenger parking lot, or maybe it's sort of like a staff parking area. As I mentioned, in the early years, there was a passenger platform that extended out into this side, but later that was gone. It was definitely gone by the 1970s, but probably earlier it was already gone. I have no idea when the Union Pacific stopped bringing passengers to Wallace. Have you noticed that a few of the default installed car assets are super tiny? Like the scale is completely wrong. I mean, half the size of a normal car. Actually, to prevent myself from accidentally putting these cars down, I tried to delete them, but they're packaged. You can't delete them. It's kind of weird. I don't get it. And then for the stains, coming back to the stains topic, admittedly, I'm just throwing the stains down in random orientation. It's not very well thought out, and maybe doesn't look very good right now. I do wish that you could use more textures to kind of add a generic, dirtier or cracked pavement here and there, like you used to be able to do without HD terrain. But the texture limit prevents that. I'm stuck with the one texture for the pavements. So that's why I have to take the extreme measure. But again, it looks very random here. Maybe doesn't look very good, but I think after all the details get put in, they blend in together perfectly decently. Okay, moving on to the residential area. There are a lot of residential assets on the DLS, but frankly, I think most of the US style assets aren't a very good match for Wallace. It has a lot of very small lots and very small houses, a lot of bungalow style houses, and then some American contemporary from the 20s and 30s. So I included just a variety of different things that I thought matched a little bit better. I included houses from Toomey. I included some bungalows, which are great. I think they're a perfect match. There are some Australian outback houses that kind of a little bit look like American contemporary here and there, but some of them maybe not so much. I included some smaller ranch style houses, a couple British houses, and a few of the derelict buildings, which still, I think, fit in perfectly decently. Then, just to ensure that I wasn't only using DLS assets, I did create 4 house assets that are based on real houses in Wallace. I think they turned out really nicely, although 2 of them seem to have a footprint that is too large compared to all the other house assets I'm placing. I'm really not sure what happened with those, since every dimension was based on Google Maps, but yeah, I did make some sort of dimensional problem there. A couple of the houses that I made are fairly generic, and then a couple are more unique. And later I did some reskinning of one of them to basically just add more variety so that I could place it elsewhere on the map. The choice of garages is even more limited than houses for, an American style garage. I made do. Of course, a lot of garages in the US are just attached, but most of these are, by nature, they have to be separate garages because most of the house assets don't have garage. At least this type of small house assets, they usually don't have their own garage. The one car garage by JR is probably the nicest one that I like. Some of the Toomey houses, I use them a lot, and I was doing this before I knew about the Drexel and Avery route and any of Toomey's other work that he'd done. I just found these were extremely useful, very generic, low poly buildings, and it's interesting, they don't really have a door or entrance, but then you hardly notice if you kind of just give them like a path, a sidewalk that leads up to one side. Somehow the mind fills in the gaps, and it seems like it's totally connected, totally logical. Making these residential blocks, the first block was fun, doing the first lawns, adding the sidewalks, the driveways. Then the second block, I'd say, was a bit tedious, and then after that, all of the blocks were highly tedious. And in this build series, I'm trying to show the complete process, but only an overview. And then for these relatively boring parts, I used timestamps so that you can skip ahead when you're bored, which I assume you might be. And then by creating these four highly detailed and totally unique blocks for Wallace, I now had four or more scrapbook assets that I used to save time in future town building. And it does save a lot of time, but it doesn't completely eliminate the repetition because when you paste these down, it never totally matches the orientation. And ultimately, you have to retexture them for the new location anyway. So yeah, it's still going to be repetitive, and I'm still not going to show it except for in this episode for the most part. The route has 13 towns, of which 4 towns are roughly the same size of Wallace in terms of residential area that has to be covered. The rest of the towns are a little bit smaller, but just rest assured that the other towns will be done as highlights, and this is the only time that you will be exposed to this particular process. And again, feel free to skip ahead. And you can see that I did use a few of those half-sized cars and SUVs in this area. I didn't even notice at that time. Now looking, I can see that I had used them. A few of the houses, they maybe don't fit in that well. I do like this big Australian ranch building on the corner in a few places. And yeah, that one doesn't really match the real style of Wallace, but if you do look around Wallace, you'll see that the houses really do come in a variety of sizes. Yes, there are many small houses, but there are also some big ones. A lot of them are kind of Victorian style, some brick. Here in these blocks towards the southwest side of the valley, I'm not going to show them, but I did put in more apartment sized, like small apartment sized buildings. Many of them are the taller Toomey buildings. And there are indeed a few apartment buildings in that area of Wallace. Now, skipping ahead a bit after I had completed most of those residential blocks, the residential part now mostly filled in, so I needed to add the high school and an elementary school. They're not actually in the correct locations, by the way. And then, there's not much choice on the DLS in terms of schools, but I do like these two. The cream color one that I put down here and then deleted, I did just use that in Silverton, only a little ways down the road. The basketball court seems like a nice addition here. I think it's a good quality asset, even though I think in reality Wallace has a football field and maybe a baseball field in this area, but I decided to go kind of for a more crowded look for Wallace. For the elementary school, I put down this green playground asset, but later I replaced that. I wonder why this asset is totally all green. Like, was it an extremely early asset, or is there some error? Maybe the texture accidentally got replaced with all green. I don't know. I can't think of what the logic of making it entirely green would be. And then, putting down a little temporary auxiliary office for when the school ran out of space, that's always a nice touch, I think. I love putting down the little lines for kids to line up on. I don't know, did you do that when you were a kid? This building, honestly, is really not too far off the look of my own elementary school in Montana. And then finally, nothing ties the school scene together like school buses out front, even if the time is not correct for being served by school buses. Now, heading down the road, We're starting to link the edge of town on this side up with the highway going out to the west, and the high school here, arguably, it doesn't have enough parking, not by today's standards anyway. I imagine this little grass area in front as originally being a nice little park for people to hang out on, but then students just kept driving up on it, so they had to add Jersey barriers to keep that from happening. There are a few other really nice assets to use down here. I especially like this roadside hamburger joint. I'm a huge fan of putting down picnic tables outside with umbrellas, and I can't get enough of scenes like that. And this other small diner, I think it fits into the same era almost, especially, the Dr. Pepper sign I like. And basically, there we are, the residential part of Wallace. It's all done. And then after this, I really felt a little bit like I needed to take a break from Wallace and tackle another area for a while because the Wallace yard industry and downtown Wallace buildings, they're all a bit daunting. A lot of custom assets for that area need to get created. So, in the next episode, we'll be teleporting on to the next town over, which is Mullan, Idaho. If you'd like to join, please hit the like and subscribe buttons, and we'll see you again next time on the Wallace Branch.